Testing, testing. Are we recording?
Yeah, we're recording right now.
Okay,
Yes.
that's good. I like being recorded.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the critique group panel. So, we're going to talk about what critique groups are, what makes a good critique group, tips for leaving and taking feedback.
Mhm.
So, first, what is a critique group?
This is the part where I chime in, right?
Yes, you go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I would say that a critique group. Well, most people probably have done workshops before. If not for writing, then something else. It's a group where you basically come together with other people of similar interests, and you try to hash out what works in a certain practice and what doesn't. And in that regard, a critique group for writing isn't really all that different from anything you can do in any other kind of skill. But I think what can set it apart is that writing, has genres. You have your genres of fantasy, sci-fi, mystery, romance, and so a critique group should ideally be organized around types of stories that its members want to tell, because you can't really just jam people from all kinds of writing preferences into a single group and have things work out.
You
so
kind of can, but it can get interesting.
Yeah.
I prefer the group to at least be all fiction, since that's what I write. After that, the genre doesn't matter as much. I was once part of a in-person group, so with the in-person groups, because they're location-based, there's even less curating. And it was a good group. I did once have a lovely lady tell me that I should explain what AI is.
Oh god.
But she
Um,
also knew it might be bad advice. So, she said something like, but I don't read science fiction. So when you come at a critique group where you might be reading something that you don't read this, you can always say that. Like, you can still leave your feedback, but you could say, oh, by the way, I
Mhm.
don't really read science fiction. So I just, smiled and thanked her. I mean, she wasn't rude
Smile
or
and wave,
anything.
boys. Smile and wave.
yeah.
I mean, you know, so critique groups, they can come in different forms like that. I've been a part of a couple that were in person
Mm.
and been a part of a lot, of course, that were online. And even the ones online can come in different forms too. So
Mm.
sometimes they might meet kind of like this and have a voice chat while you're looking at the text. What's I found even more common is maybe an email exchange or something that's just in text,
Mm.
which can be more accommodating for schedules. You get the um
That's true.
you,
Yeah.
yeah, you get the things you're supposed to comment on and you can comment on them, and you have a deadline like to finish by the week.
Right.
I think the biggest difference I've found between a place like Discord and email is that some of my email critique groups were very against using Google Drive or another sharing method because they
Oh,
Interesting.
specifically didn't want you to be able to see other people's comments.
oh. Okay.
Oh,
Interesting. Uh,
Yeah, that's
Did
kind of what I said. I mean,
did they say why they didn't want people to see everyone else's comments?
I've heard it more than once, so I'm definitely not trying to make fun of it, but I think it's this idea that you'll influence each other instead of seeing what everyone's thoughts are on their own.
oh, I
Mm.
can see it. And that's still interesting because to me, if I can see other people's comments, sometimes I also learn too because other people will be like, such a thing as needs to be improved. And I look at it and I'm like, I would never have thought of that. I'm like, oh, oops,
Yeah.
I did that. Or something
No,
like that.
I agree. And
Well,
there could be other reasons like just not liking Google Drive.
yeah. Mm,
Because if you're using email, you might be sending out a file and getting the file back, but then you have to put it all together at the end.
right.
So
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay.
So another way that they can be different from each other is if you are trying to curate different stages of writing.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah.
So what's your experience with that? Have you ever been in a group where the stages were curated or they were very different from each other?
Yes. So this was actually most of my experience back when I did critique groups initially, um, because I think what happened, right? I was part of another writing group, and they kind of just organized critique groups or formed them based on like common schedules. Like, hey, who's available at this time? And then I'd be like, I am available at that time, and then they're available at that time. And then we would say, oh, what do you guys write? And then, you have all sorts of things there. I write fantasy. A couple of them were like, I write poetry, and all of these things. And so we would just kind of get together based on that. But you could tell the first few sessions, no one really knows what to do with the other person's work besides give feedback, right? But I think we were all a bit inexperienced. We didn't know what exactly that looked like. What does good feedback look like? What does appropriate feedback look like? And I think the some people say they're more available than they actually are. They say, "Oh, I'm available at this time," and then lo and behold, they don't show up at the time. And so it just became a bit of a balancing act and trying to be truthful with everyone to make sure that we could actually get something productive done. Because a lot of the time, it was difficult, especially if people haven't done something like that before, which I think some of us hadn't at that point.
Yeah, and I think I remember you ran that critique group.
A few critique groups, yes. Um, those were some difficult times.
Well, I feel you for the part where people say they're available and they don't show up. Because I remember I almost joined that critique group, but I was in a critique group where we emailed each other and we didn't have to meet at a certain time. And that was very useful for the type of schedule that I have. So
Mm,
it's kind of like, pluses and minuses. But I think if you can be on voice chat or meet at the same time, it can really accelerate the comments because you'll hear more from people than they might leave in text. Unless they're me, I'll leave plenty. I'll
mm,
explain. I'll explain what I'm thinking.
yeah, 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 yeah.
But the different stages might be things like, is this your first draft? And
Yep.
I do think it's helpful to at least know that, because I think if it's an early draft, and you might not want to be leaving a bunch of inline comments about, oh, you're missing a
Mm,
comma.
right,
Right.
right. This is actually something that I think some inexperienced critique group members also may have not considered. I certainly didn't consider it the first time, which is telling people what stage you're at in terms of writing your manuscript. Is this a first draft? Is this a second draft? Because with the kind of feedback you get or want but may not always communicate clearly to people changes based on that. And so yeah, a lot of the time it's like I was on my second draft with that story, but people would say, wow, it's so polished, is this your first draft? And I'm like, no, it's my second draft. Oh, okay. And while that feels good that people think it's like a final draft, in reality it prevented them from saying things because they thought everything was already set in stone. But it's like, no, tell me what
Yeah.
what you want, or what you think could be done different. Because a lot of the times they just,
Yeah, it's also helpful for people to know your goals. So the kind of middle stages of drafting, if you're like, oh, this is my third draft, this is my fourth draft, they kind of muddy together. But just knowing, like, is this your first draft? Have you been editing it? Have you gotten feedback before? Do you think you're about ready to hit publish? Because I will give you different feedback and tell you if I think you're not anywhere near ready.
hmm,
So knowing somebody's goals. um and I've also read works where I was like, yeah, I could see this being um published theoretically after this last edit, but just knowing if that's what somebody's thinking can be important.
right.
It also tells you a little bit about their method, because I know, Amber, you pants, right?
Yes, very much.
I think that can change a lot because when I got into some critique groups with people who are like, "Oh yes, this is my first draft," I'm like, "Are you crazy?" Turns out they're all pantsers.
Hmm.
so,
Yeah.
so then they'll go and change things if you are like this plot point doesn't make sense. They'll actually change the whole thing. So different stages, different goals. I think at least communication, even if you're not curating to all be at the same stage.
Yeah, it's true. And also, like you were mentioning with the more like earlier writers and stuff who are the learning stuff, and it's nice to know that they. I mean, sometimes it can be obvious, but it's also nice to know where they are too, because you know, sometimes I know some groups are more patient with the beginners or not, you know, and it's totally understandable because sometimes you end up spending more time on like the beginners and stuff, like more effort and all that, and which is okay too. Like some people don't like doing that, so
Uh-huh.
you know, you know, so because it's just you want to be able sometimes to just read through and then just make a few notes of what you like, and sometimes with the beginners you're more, oh my gosh, so much.
Mhm.
But at
Yeah.
the same time, you know, at the same time, like some people like me, I'm more patient about it because I
Yeah.
know
Yep.
they are getting started, and I know that I can help them get started, and
Mm.
they're going to also learn a lot too because they probably not seen, you know, like the writing process of other people, you know, and being able to watch them do that and be able to input a little bit yourself, even if all you have to do is like point out typos at this point because you don't know what else to fix. No, that is totally fine because you're going to
Mhm.
be able to see the other people's things. This is not like this is good. This is not no whatever, and you learn that. That's how I learned. You know, I would just
Mhm.
well, beginner when I started critique group, and then I started learning. You know, it's great. It's a great way to learn. So,
Right.
yeah.
So following on that, what makes a good critique group? Because I think Amber basically just said not necessarily how it's curated. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be that everybody is at the same stage of writing or at their writing journey.
Right. Well, I would say, but look, when people write, and especially the first times that they're writing, I think that there's a very real fear of being criticized, and just the fear of
Yeah.
putting something of yourself into a situation where it's very vulnerable, and people are scared of that. Sometimes they don't want to be vulnerable, but asking for critique is inherently doing that. It's being put in a vulnerable situation, and I think one of the things then that makes a good critique group is really respect, like mutual respect, and an acknowledgement no- of the other person being also at different stages compared to you, because that way you're not too harsh on them even if you think that they're writing a shit. And then likewise, if you're the person receiving feedback, then you can be gracious enough to acknowledge, oh, this person probably knows what they're talking about, I should definitely listen to them, kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, it's also helpful if, like we've always said, with communication and all that, and not just with each other, but also with our submissions and stuff. Like, we have to also agree on, like, not just the nitty gritty things like length of the thing, and um, but also like where are we comfortable with reading. So it's also very helpful to have things like, you know, content warnings, for
Mm,
example. So
right.
right, so people can decide ahead of time whether, you know, they're comfortable reading this piece. That's just more than fair. And but sometimes what I've gotten people to do is that maybe I have a content warning part where I don't know, like there's somebody shot the other end out, and there was a bunch of blood and whatever, and so I might say there's a blood warning, but
Right.
it's only maybe a small scene. So maybe they're just passing through and shoot randomly somebody. I don't know, but I might just go into the scene and then just make a comment where the scene starts and where it ends. So if people still want to read the rest of it, they can just skip that part kind of thing.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's
and when with my email group I was a part of, we were doing chapter by chapter, but when things, from running any kind of group, that if people drop out and people join in the middle sometimes. So you would
yeah,
get people who hadn't read like the first half of your book, or because we did a rotation schedule, so it was actually a month between chapters.
okay,
So we would write a little bit of a summary at the beginning.
Hmm.
Nothing too long, but just kind of a reminder, like you're here, because normally when you read a book, you don't wait a month between chapters.
Yeah, no, no,
So
no, no, indeed.
yeah,
you're like, who is this again, right? So just a little summary to remind them where they are. Um, because if you're in the last half of a book, it's quite normal to not be able to just jump in there.
Mhm.
So that would be where I would put something like oh, by the way, this book's pretty adult. Like the whole thing, I can't even mark the chapters for you, sorry. Um,
Uh, yeah.
yeah. So what about when I mean, obviously that's very helpful. Like just basically, I think the biggest thing when you're setting up and all that is just like obviously communicating with each other, like what I said earlier, just make sure everything's clear, like your expectations, what you want out of it as well. And um we also like being encouraging with each other and all that. And sometimes people get either very snotty sometimes while they're writing, or
Naughty.
they can be um, I don't know how exactly the word I'm looking for at the moment. It's early, but
well, I can give the listener some very basic things you want to clear beforehand.
yes,
So, as a funny example, one of the critique groups I joined, they said, we're going to submit the chapter, right?
mm,
But at the time, somebody who may have been me didn't actually know how long a chapter should be.
oops,
Really?
So then people were submitting different links, because what does a chapter mean? So we
Ah,
had to go back and say, okay, wait a minute, we meant this many words. I was like, okay, now you're speaking a language that I can speak. You know, you have to
yeah,
have something definitive, like how many words, because it's kind of not fair if somebody's submitting something 3,000 words long and somebody's submitting 10,000, 12,000 words long.
yep.
yeah,
So submission length and any deadlines, because we didn't meet in person. If you meet in voice or in person, then that deadline is obvious. But if you don't, then you just have to define those. And not that you have to kick somebody out of the group if they're not meeting those, but sometimes people do drop off of the face of the earth. So those kinds of things help you say, like, okay, we've been really patient and waited 5 sessions. I don't think so and so's with us anymore. Right?
Yeah. Th- This just kind of goes back to what I said about respect. Like, guys, everyone, what make, and this goes back to what makes a good critique group. It's like, everyone is putting aside time and effort to try to make this thing happen, because they want to get better. So if for some reason you can't mm, keep up the commitment because, life happens, just let people know about it so that they can adjust.
Yeah, but
It's really,
sometimes
it's
when life happens, you forget. You're like,
that,
I'm too sick to remember, right? So just as a
that's
group
true.
leader,
Like, just
you
do your
just
best.
don't take it personally, right?
Just do your best.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I try not to. We try not to take it personally. It's really just a case of like we want to do our best to make these things happen, and we feel like the best way to do that is with a group that is together and unanimous, and all of that. But sometimes you can't be like that, and that's fine. But if you can spare a moment to recall, oh right, I can't make it, and then you just tell people one quick
Yeah,
message,
just basic
then
communication.
it's just
Um,
just basic communication.
before we
Yeah.
jump into what, I know we have a question in chat, but I would just like when you were talking, Michelle, about like what a chapter is and all that. I just very much reminded me when we, Dell and I used to be in the same critique group, and I just like it was kind of hilarious. My critique groups are usually maximum 5,000 words long, and Dell will be like 4,999 seriously all the time.
Mhm.
I'm just like,
So
why?
Fane does have a question. I think the question would be perfect for our next question point is what is good feedback? So let me just finish out what makes a good critique group and then we can read that question.
Okay.
So the last couple things about a good critique group all have to do with expectations. I and about how to handle if there's some personality clashes. So, along with the submission length, I would consider talking about how much line by line critique is necessary or wanted. Because I have had some people try to tell me that I can't leave any line by line, and I usually end up not critiquing for them anymore
Oh,
because I had one person who I was like, okay, fine, and I left them a summary of my feedback, and then
Yeah,
they asked me which page something was on, and I was like, oh no. You
yeah,
don't get to tell me I can't leave line by line and then ask me where something is in your work. So
yeah.
but at
yeah,
the same
it's
time,
true.
I've also had somebody completely try to rewrite my voice. And I'm
Okay.
like, "Oh, this is what those people don't want."
No.
So, you kind of talk about what level of feedback is expected or important.
Yeah,
And if you're early in your draft, you might really not don't even bother correcting commas. I know that can be hard for some people, but you're literally wasting your time, right?
Mm,
Because
mm.
they're just going to rewrite the whole line. So and for egos, I know on my side of it, I don't mind the voice chats, especially now that I'm more experienced, but it really helped when back in the old days,
The
it
old
was
days.
just email. Like you just or in person.
no.
Like I think just Skype existed. That was about it, right? And
Yeah,
so I would read the feedback and then not respond right away. Because sometimes your knee-jerk response is like, no, you're wrong, or trying to justify, right?
Yep.
So you need to be able to deal with egos with yourself, but also with the group and be able to step in and say, like, hey, that sounded really harsh. Let's try
yeah,
to be more understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, like critiquing, both receiving and giving, it's an experience of like sharing yourself. So you just have to make
yeah,
sure that you keep that in mind and really be a sponge, be a gracious sponge and a gracious a gracious river. Give graciously and receive graciously as well. But I think sometimes, especially for people who haven't done something like this before,
right.
um, they're not sure what that means. Like, oh, because I'm more experienced, this person is benefiting from whatever I'm telling them, and then they go overboard. Then other people, it's like, don't hurt me, and then they don't. You can't give them any feedback because they're too sensitive. So it's be open, communicate with each other, be open, and just don't be a dick.
Yeah. Or you might, even if you're not sensitive and like, I'm going to go cry or be mad kind of way, if you spend so much time trying to justify and explain, I'm like, I'm sorry, as a critiquer, did not actually want or need a novel back. Like, you don't even have to tell me if you took my feedback, but it's, just spend some time thinking about why I would have said that and how to change or if to change your work.
Mm,
Yeah, it's true.
Because if you spend too much time justifying, then it just kind of sounds like you're not
Yeah,
listening.
yep, yep.
that's very true.
Or you're missing the point of like, well, that's nice that you have an explanation, but it's not coming through in text.
Yeah. So
Yes.
as far actually touching on that, something that I've noticed with critique groups is one of the most common things that tends to set people off is when you as a critique someone who's critiquing tells someone, oh, it's not coming across, I don't get this part, can you explain? And then usually the response sometimes is, oh, it's like this, and I don't know how you can't get that. And I'm like, my dude, I don't get it because it's not coming across very clearly, and you just need to be able to clarify this part. But then some people, especially those with egos, they do become unable to move past that, and basically it becomes like a free for all of like, well, I don't want to listen to you because you hurt my feelings. So I think
Yeah.
this is a pitfall that all critique group members should be aware of, which is, don't take it personally. We're here to bash the living hell out of your work, not you.
And
I
one
know.
thing you can do to help with that is when you leave feedback, if it's something that I've left feedback where I say, listen, this is my life experience that informs my feedback. That sounds big, but I might be, like I've left notes that are like, by the way, I'm a psychology major.
Mm,
So, like, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. So I don't know everything, but I also don't know nothing. And I'm trying to comment on specifically the psychological aspect of the book,
mm,
just to give people an idea of where you're coming from because they don't know you.
yeah,
Or when that lady was like, I think you should explain AI, but I also don't read science fiction. I'm like, okay, you know? So then her comment didn't bother me because it's like, okay, so yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I have a point that I'll bounce off from Dell's experiences. When people are really resistant in terms of critique. That's all another hold on. Let me see what it's done here. Good morning, John.
good
Oh, yeah,
morning.
I'm quite here yet. Uh, what I was going to say was, good morning. What I was going to say was with sometimes the people being resistant to critique and all that. And another reason, just good reason to know about their goals and stuff, and also a bit of maybe a little bit of background about their piece, because sometimes they are writing uh, with their own experiences and stuff, so which can also be a little bit tricky, because sometimes if you were, for example, like somebody who is writing maybe abusive situation kind of thing, and they're actually relating to their own, background, and they're now
Mm,
critiquing this, and they'll be kind of like, so you're invalidating me, kind of thing. So and you're like, no, bro, we're not doing that. But we're critiquing the words in the page, so like not necessarily the intent behind it, kind of thing. So
yeah.
sometimes people will say, they're trying to change my life story, and I'm like, no. So that can also be a reason. So
Mm,
something to work around as well, and you sometimes be a little more not delicate about maybe, but sometimes yes, but
yeah. And
yeah, if you know what I mean.
maybe this also touches on another thing that I would personally wish I had known or been told sooner in my writing journey, is that ultimately you're writing something that you're presenting to people, and whether that story is something meaningful to you, like it's based on, say, for example, your trauma that you experienced growing up, or if
Yeah.
it's something more benign. I just wanted to tell a story about cute fairies or something. People are going to see this and they're going to have different opinions and thoughts about this, and you as a writer have to be prepared for that, where there's no magical land where you release something and everyone loves it and instantly gets the message you're trying to say, and no one says anything harsh about it. Would be nice, but we don't live in that kind of world. So um it's kind of like that situation where you ask someone a question and you're
Mhm.
only prepared to hear one kind of answer, so when they say another answer, you're shocked, like, hey, Do you think I'm fat? And then you expect everyone to say, no, of course not. But then they say, yeah. And they're like, oh, shit. So, like, what do you prepare for that? So, it's like, don't ask a question you're not prepared to hear the answer to. Similarly, if you're going to write something, unless you're writing it exclusively for yourself, you never intend to share it with anyone. Just be prepared to receive all kinds of feedback from it.
But
no one's
that
gonna
is
like.
also something where it's helpful to have some experienced critique group members. I mean, you only gain experience by being part of one. Because if you're releasing a book and you have the title and the blurb, you're hopefully, if they're well written and everything, getting your audience. But when you join a critique group, you may very well not be getting your audience. So yeah, they're going to have more varied responses. So you have to consider that.
No one's going to like. No one's going to love your story more than you, kind of thing. That's a lot of people forget sometimes, and I think obviously you want people to love your story, but you're going to want who's going to love it the most, kind of thing. So. So people are not trying to like pick on you most of the time, hopefully. Like they're trying to make your story, help the story be better, kind of thing. So.
Yes, even the person who completely rewrote my voice, I actually, it was frustrating, mostly in the how do I now respond to him way. But he actually was not mean personally or saying anything like I'm a terrible writer or anything like that. It was just more awkward.
Yeah.
But I was glad it was not my first critique experience. But even beyond that, if you might be getting good critique, but it might be from someone who's frankly not your audience. So you just have to take it with a grain of salt. And that's why leaving some idea of where you're coming from as a critiquer is also helpful.
Yeah, because everyone needs to know, this is any kind of communication is a two-way street. So it can really only help everyone if everyone knows kind of where everyone's coming from. But some people don't share certain details like that. I guess just because of either inexperience or they're afraid of showing those details, kind of thing. So
or they just don't want to leave long feedback. Like they don't want to overwhelm someone. But sometimes it's not overwhelming. Sometimes it's good information.
Yep.
So with that, and we've covered some of what is good feedback. But let's specifically address trigger warning question that we have, and then like sandwich method and a few other things. So the question that we had, now I have to scroll up because my text is big because I'm like half blind. They've run into trigger warning confusion. Is there a trick to figuring out trigger warnings, like what is important to put a trigger warning for and what's not? I reworded it a bit. I hope that's okay.
That's fine. So yeah, what to put trigger warnings for? See, this is something that I myself had to learn because I like to think I was a good sponge, but it was when I first started doing critique groups that I realized, or I even learned about the concept of like putting up trigger warnings, because I had never had to do something like this before. And it really varies. What do you put trigger warnings for? It really depends. Different audiences will have different sensibilities. If your story is very if it talks about race a lot and like racial tensions, this and that, you might want to put a trigger warning regarding that. If it's a darker story where there's thought of like violence and all kinds of assault, you may want to put a trigger warning about that as well. And I guess if you're in doubt over if you should put a trigger warning regarding something, you might as well just do it. At least that way people also know a bit more about your story. There's no harm in it, really. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Someone is turned off by what you have told them is in your story. They were going to get turned off by it at some point anyway. So
I do think, though, part of the issue, like the reason you would ask that is because at some point you may as well just read the chapter if I'm going to tell you everything that's in the chapter ahead of time. So So I think it could help to sometimes it could be a two-way street. Like if you're critiquing in a set critique group where you're going to be together every week and you have certain triggers, you could let the group know. So if both sides are doing a good faith effort, then there won't be hopefully any issues. So
Hopefully.
yeah. So I would say it's hard to define what's best to leave a trigger warning for, but I would say what's things that are the most common for psychological harm, because you obviously cannot be like, oh, by the way, for people who don't like round things with holes in it, which is an actual psychological thing with a real name, I can't remember. Are you going to leave a trigger warning for that? Obviously not.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Right. And then I think genre can help too, especially once you've gotten the group started and are have gotten some of the introductions out of the way. Because with certain genres, if I'm reading if I'm reading horror, I don't need a trigger warning for the common horror aspects. But maybe if there's going to be specifically child harm, that would be a good one. So being familiar with the genre helps, and not everyone is.
Yeah. I'm just recalling back the days when as a very young writer in terms of literal age, I think I was like maybe 12 when I started writing. I did not know about these kinds of things. So what's likely to cause psychological harm to someone if they read it. I had to figure out what exactly those were, because I guess my stories tend to have themes like that. But at the time I thought, oh cool, it's this thing. This person got their head chopped off and their loved one saw it in front of them. Cool. But
you also read a genre where that's kind of expected.
Yeah, but I did it. But I never thought to put trigger warnings on them, regardless. And since we are on the topic of critique groups, not all of the critique group members were privy to that genre and its conventions. So when they read it, they were like, "Del, why didn't you tell me someone was gonna get blasted apart in a shower of gore in front of their family?" And I was like, "Oh, surprise!"
I think what might help some people, even if you're not a parent, which I am, but if you think about like what would you not want a child to read, like a middle school age child, that'll start giving you an idea of what to leave trigger warnings for.
Well, I know that now, but
good job.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to mention as well for not like slightly moving on a little bit, but still within the good feedback in the group. One thing that we really believe in is the sandwich method. So this means you talk about something good in the piece, and something like constructively, like I want to say bad kind of thing, but in quotation, but and then something good. So that's your sandwich method. So it really helps because it encourages writers to like keep striving. Basically, you don't want to just you can look at it nasty and just point at all the bad stuff, and then that's it. And then it can leave people feeling kind of very down about it, and then maybe discouraged, and maybe they don't want to continue anymore, and that's no good. We want to help with that. So with the sandwich method, do you leave something good? Do you think something you liked about the piece, and then that comes on a little more of this kind of thing, and then you say, okay, this needs to be fixed or changed, or like it doesn't quite come across properly, or like whatever. And then you finish up with, overall, this part was really good. I enjoyed it, like the tension here, or something like that. And then, then you're leaving them with, you didn't do everything badly.
Yep. I call the sandwich method the focaccia shit sandwich. I hope that's okay.
Oh,
Because because you have really fancy like stuff that you the really fancy bread on either side, and then you have the
yeah.
horrible, disgusting, revolting stuff in the middle. So very very good.
Yeah. So, yeah, for sure. So that can definitely help people, and it just, and also, 'cause I know some people really like picking apart stuff, and it- using that can sort of mitigate it a little bit, because you're like you have to. So sometimes I know it's happened to me before where I read a piece, and especially maybe like beginners, and it's just like so much wrong with it. It's actually hard to find something right, but there's always something right, something nice you can say about it, because this
Mm,
person put in the effort to write a thing, and maybe it's the first time, putting, pen to paper kind of thing. You want to encourage that,
Yeah,
so
like the fact that they're even in a critique group
right,
shows
exactly.
that they're wanting to learn. Now, I will say about sandwich method that I'm more for came more from the School of Hard Knocks,
Fun.
where I had some critique partners where I'm sorry, we just said what we were thinking, like um not in a not in a mean way, but also not sugar coated.
mm,
And so for me, I do some sandwich method when it's somebody I've just met, or I can kind of
Yeah,
tell sometimes with different people. But sometimes if you're in a critique group for long enough and you know this person, you don't always
right.
have
Yeah,
to start with like voluminous sentences about how great their work is, right?
yep.
right.
Sometimes I might just say, there were several things I liked, but I didn't want to leave you too many comments because I
Mm,
know this person. Um, so the sandwich method is important to understand. It's not necessarily a thing you have to do every
Or you can do like
single
an open
time.
face sandwich. you know, like basically, well, obviously you're not gonna if you don't have to have it on both ends, right? It's an open face sandwich, so you could do that.
Right. But I think some of that comes with how well you know that person. Like if
yeah,
it's your first
Yeah,
critique for them.
because you
yeah,
can't just say you can't usually just say these kinds of things to for someone you've never met. That's kind of just being a dick about it. But I guess when it comes to the topic of sandwich method versus other kinds of frameworks for giving feedback, I know what you're talking about, where you kind of just give it to each other, no no sugar coating. Um, but I do wonder if because this is a kind of giving feedback where essentially there's no filter. I'm wondering how you're able to make sure that you're not filtering your feedback, but you're also not adding onto it with your own, let's say your own voice in terms of that you actually make it come out harsher than you actually intended. Like, how do you practice that self control or self awareness?
I think it also really helps if you. Uh, that's another reason why it's good to have like the group together sometimes, because
Mm,
you can discuss it as well, and then sometimes the person, other people can say, "Are you sure you meant that?" or actually have other people to bounce off of, right? Excuse me. And or you can see how people react with each other inside the thing, like the thing, the mission. There we go. Um,
hmm
and you might see other people like see it a bit milder, and you're like, oh, maybe I did go a little too hard. When sometimes the person themselves will tell you, you know, I'm not sure how to react to this, and you might realize I might have went too far. So
mm,
it does take practice, though. It really does. It's like it also, yeah, you have to kind of. It helps knowing the person as well a little bit. So if you don't know this person at all, then you might not go as hard on something, until you get to know them a bit more and the writing style and whatnot. So the first time around, like for like usually my critique group, the new person, if we have a new person in,
Hmm.
the first time that we have them, we're not generally not going to be like, everything is shit. so, we're going to be quite a bit
Also, not
nice.
helpful when people are just like, "I loved it." And you're like,
Yeah,
Okay.
like what am I supposed to do with that? Like a critique group was formed so that we could become better at writing. If you just tell me you
Yeah,
loved it, it's like, oh, sweet, I've reached the end. I don't need the critique group anymore. But that's probably not the case, right? There's all probably something somewhere that you can change, and you just want to
I,
find out what it is.
right. And I think even if the only thing you have to say is positive, it's still helpful to qualify a little
Mm,
because you might have other people leaving comments and they might disagree with you. So if you just say I love it, then that doesn't weigh very well against someone who has pointed out something specific.
yeah, and
And that is where it can be helpful to see each other's comments because I have not too often, but I'll go in behind other people and be like, I disagree with your comment, you know?
yeah, because this is supposed to be a discussion, right? If you phrase things in such a way that there's no discussion, then why are we here?
In fact, I think I just reminded Blue on something. We were discussing something we were critiquing. And I was like, oh no, that is a turn of phrase I hear all the time. Right? Like that's so sometimes a turn of phrase or something might be
yeah,
or
but
something
like,
that's a genre expectation. It might be like very individual how people react.
yeah, I
Yep.
think it's super fun when we have, when you were just mentioning the turning face thing, it's super fun when you can kind of see uh, other people's voices and or also you can kind of tell where they're from as well, which is that I one thing is super fun when I do the critique with my editor because what he does is that he reads everybody's thing and he does them like out loud and all that, and he can pick out my Canadianisms and like or
Your
he can
Canadianisms.
yeah, he can tell like and like he'll be like, oh, that is so Canadian. That's such a Canadian sentence. And I'm like, really? Or he'll tell with another person she's from Tennessee and in the South kind of thing, and he'll be like, that's just such a Southern phrase or whatever. And we're like, really? And you think it's super fun to be able to pick that out, but you have to have obviously experience to know these things and all that.
Yeah, and sometimes like it doesn't mean you can't leave a note, but
Make sure.
as a writer, you just maybe if it's just one phrase in your whole novel, you might remove it. If it's a voice thing and it's there a lot, then your reader might have to get over it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we
So
have time to like we are going
yeah,
over quickly.
we're about out of time. So let me just go quickly over just some of our things we did want to cover and then our last question.
Yes.
So one of the things that I've noticed can make a critique sound harsher than intended is if someone uses hyperbole.
Mm.
Don't use
Yes.
hyperbole. Just say what you mean.
Yep.
You know, it's too easy to take the wrong way. And also don't nitpick just to nitpick. And
Right.
what I mean by that is when a story actually is pretty good and it's ready
And just
for inline comments, and maybe this person doesn't want inline comments, or you're going through and saying, like, I would phrase this way, or I would phrase it that way. Sometimes I feel like people leave comments just to have something to
just
leave.
to leave comments. Yeah, because it's like you said. If everything you have to say is just positive, on those rare occasions, then qualify it, but don't say anything negative just for the sake of saying something negative, because it's kind of doing a disservice to everyone. The person you're critiquing winds up with a false impression of what you actually think. Um,
Yeah, well, I don't
and
think people do it on purpose. I think they just feel like they have a job and then they start confusing their preferences for what is actual editing. And maybe they're not editors. So sometimes if I want to leave a comment, I'll put this is my preference.
mm, Yeah, but it also makes their job, so to speak, harder because you have to rack your brain when you nitpick, right? You have to think, oh, what am I gonna say?
Yeah.
Oh, rephrase this. So it's like, my dude, just say, you don't have to say it like that. Just give your honest thoughts, but qualify it if everything you have to say is actually just positive.
Yeah, so I would keep in mind that some things do come down to preference, and once the work is down to a preference level, that's great. And you can still leave some comments, but I would qualify it as this is really my preference. This is more about voice or about like possibly, like we were saying, turns and phrases, like where you're from. Um, so then the very last thing we want to talk about was how far into the publishing process a critique group can get you.
Hmm.
Um, and I think when the critique group forms, that's one of the reasons it's important to talk about
Mhm.
what everyone's goals are just a little bit, you know?
One thing, an important thing with that, the critique can help you on your way to publishing because your critique group are your readers and stuff. And that's what they're going to look at things as a reader and obviously as their critiquer. But one important thing to note is that your critique group is not your editor. And so you still need to run this thing by a professional editor because we are not paid professionals.
Yeah,
Um,
and
so,
sometimes having 15 voices is actually not helpful.
Mm-mm.
so and also, it also it does not it should not. I mean, it should also get you started with the editing. Absolutely, critique groups are really good with that. Um, but it should not also take place of all your editing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes it's really helpful to have one or like just two voices at the end.
Mm.
Yeah,
And one phenomenon too, if you are self-publishing and really want to publish this, is keep in mind that the critique group saw your earlier draft.
Uh-huh.
yeah.
So they're
That's
not
for
doing
the
this
most
on
helpful. Yeah.
purpose. Yeah, they're not doing this on purpose, but psychologically they're like, oh, it's so much better. That actually doesn't mean it's done.
Like with my own process, what I've been doing is that with my own process, I've done my draft. I've done several drafts actually, and then I ran one draft completely through a critique group.
Mm.
It was super helpful, and then I took that draft and I fixed it and I sent it to my editor. So my editor has now got my more improved draft, which is
Mm-hmm.
I'm so thankful. And then and he went through it, and obviously there's still plenty of stuff to edit. So what I've been doing now, because I'm close to the end of my book, like my publishing the story. Oh, I'm now going to when I finish editing it from my editor, I'm actually going to I'm exchanging it with one other person, maybe two, and to for the final thing to make sure it actually looks good. No, there's no weirdnesses after the edits, and then I can hopefully publish it. That is the plan anyway. So
Yeah, and if you look for interviews of people who are fairly widely published, even self-published authors who've had some success, that is often the process they describe, where they do run their work through critique group or through some kind of reader group, but it's not the only thing they do. So that's just something to keep in mind because I hate to see it when people get really excited that they finished with critique group and then they hit publish and it doesn't always go well after that,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Because
it's very competitive out there.
yeah, like critique groups, they're nice. They're really useful, actually. But unless there's someone there who is a straight up professional editor who is deciding to give you all of their expertise for free, you probably want to take your story after critique groups throughout a few more rounds of refinement, and one of which is an editor, just to try to give yourself the best chance that you have. Um, because there's no replacement for industry knowledge that editors ought to have. And critique groups, they may have the best of intentions, but they may not always have that knowledge and expertise.
Right, and not everyone's goal is to publish, or they know
Mm.
they're not that close to publishing this particular one. So I still like critique groups for some of those stories because for one thing, it lets me share early.
Mm.
You know, you're sitting on this novel forever if you're not sharing it.
Yeah, some people just like to share because,
Well, I
hey,
still want the feedback, but I mean, you kind of get almost despondent, like, oh, still working on this thing, and you have no feedback. So,
mm,
depending partly on your personality, even just being able to share it and get some feedback is helpful. It can
Yeah,
theoretically save you time as a pantser if someone's like, hey, this sub thread really isn't working at all.
mm.
yeah. Okay, I think we probably should wrap up because I think the next panel is waiting to go. So, but yeah, the sure if you have any other questions, you should drop them in chat or I mean not in chat, but in the channel. There we go. That's the right word.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay. If it's like, give me like 30 seconds. I was answering some things in the text, which
yeah,
I don't think's in the transcript. So I did give a quick list of common trigger warnings, and if something's left off, that's not my intention, but just a list for someone to start with.
sure.
So trigger warnings might include abuse of any kind, psychological disorders such as depression, um, uh, graphic harm to children or pets, and substance abuse. And if you think about movie ratings, there can be a wide variety of description, even in things meant for adults. So anything that couldn't be made middle grade, you might just give like a little note, like, hey, this book's violent to your critique group. And if you think of it as a personal relationship, you're actually being a little more careful than you might be than a publisher might be
Mhm.
when they publish a book, because then they depend on genre and they're getting the right audience, whereas you might have a more varied audience. So just like you wouldn't assume that your friend reads erotica, you would give them a heads up before you recommend a spicy book. So I hope that helps with the trigger warning question.
Mhm.
Perfect. Well, that was great. And I think we shall wrap up here. And I want to thank everybody for coming and listening and presenting and all that. That was very much fun. That was a very good first panel today.
Of the day. Wow.
Yeah, thank you so much. I shall end recording.